The skeletal fingers of a child clutched at the earth, desperately searching for anything edible among the rotting potato plants. Her hollow eyes, sunken deep into her skull, reflected nothing but the vast emptiness of hunger that had consumed her body for weeks. This was Ireland in 1847, not some medieval wasteland, but a modern European nation under the rule of the world's most powerful empire. The stench of death hung heavy in the air as bodies lay unburied in ditches, their faces frozen in the final agony of starvation. In the village of Skibbereen, witnesses reported seeing children with mouths stained green from eating grass, their bellies swollen with hunger while their limbs had withered to mere bones covered with translucent skin. But this wasn't how it started. Just 5 years earlier, Ireland had been a land of relative prosperity, its rolling green fields producing abundant crops that fed not only its own population but exported food across the British Empire. The Irish people, though poor by English standards, had found a way to thrive on their small plots of land, raising large families on the humble potato, a miracle crop that could feed a family of 6 on just an acre of land. Villages bustled with life, children played in the fields, and the traditional music of fiddles and flutes filled the evening air. The potato had become so central to Irish life that it comprised up to 60% of the nation's diet. How could a society so dependent on a single crop not see the catastrophe that awaited them? How did the failure of one plant transform a nation of 8 million into a graveyard where over 1 million would perish and another 2 million would flee in desperation? The transformation from prosperity to apocalypse raises haunting questions that echo through history. What kind of system allows children to starve to death while food is exported from their homeland? How did British authorities, claiming to represent Christian civilization and enlightened governance, watch an entire population descend into starvation without meaningful intervention? What drove landlords to evict dying families from their homes in the midst of the worst humanitarian crisis of the 19th century? The answers reveal not just a natural disaster, but a catastrophe amplified by human cruelty, indifference, and an economic system that valued profit over human life. To understand the depths of suffering that would unfold, we must first grasp the world that existed before the blight. Ireland in 1845 was a conquered nation, having been under English and then British rule for centuries. The majority Catholic population lived as tenants on land owned by Protestant landlords, many of whom resided in England and viewed their Irish estates merely as sources of income. The Acts of Union in 1801 had dissolved the Irish Parliament, placing the island's fate entirely in the hands of Westminster. The penal laws, though mostly repealed by the 1840s, had left deep scars. Catholics had been forbidden from owning land, voting, or holding office for generations. This created a society where millions of Irish farmers didn't own the land they worked, couldn't improve their holdings without risking rent increases, and survived on the knife's edge of subsistence. The stage was set for catastrophe, requiring only a spark to ignite the kindling of centuries of oppression and neglect. The warning signs began subtly in the autumn of 1845. Farmers noticed something wrong with their potato crops, dark spots appearing on the leaves, a strange smell emanating from the fields. Within days, entire crops turned black and putrid, melting into a foul-smelling mush. The speed of destruction was breathtaking. What would later be identified as Phytophthora infestans, a water mold that thrived in Ireland's damp climate, spread like wildfire across the country. But this was just the beginning. The true horror lay not in the loss of a single year's crop, but in what would follow year after year of failure, each bringing new depths of human suffering. The workhouses, designed to be so miserable that only the truly desperate would enter, would soon overflow with the dying. Ships that would become known as coffin ships would carry desperate emigrants across the Atlantic, many never to reach the other shore. Families would be torn apart, children orphaned, entire villages depopulated. The worst was yet to come, and few could imagine the scenes of horror that would unfold across the Emerald Isle. As the first reports of crop failure reached London in the fall of 1845, British Prime Minister Robert Peel initially responded with some concern, ordering the secret purchase of Indian corn from America. But this response, limited and delayed, would prove tragically inadequate. The British government, committed to the emerging ideology of laissez-faire economics, believed that market forces and private charity should address the crisis. They feared that providing direct aid would create dependency among the Irish poor, whom many British officials already viewed as lazy and backward. This ideological commitment to non-intervention would soon collide with the reality of mass starvation. As we will see, the story of the Great Famine is not merely one of crop failure, but of human choices that condemned millions to suffer and die. The true horror of what would unfold in the coming chapters of this dark history was beyond anything Europe had witnessed in the modern age. Little did the Irish people know that they were about to endure one of the most devastating humanitarian catastrophes of the 19th century, one that would forever change the face of their nation and scatter their people across the globe. The story of Ireland's dependency on the potato began long before the famine struck. In the early 1800s, the potato had transformed from a garden curiosity into the foundation of Irish survival. This South American crop, introduced to Ireland in the late 1500s, thrived in the country's cool, damp climate and rocky soil where grain crops struggled. By 1840, a single acre of potatoes could yield up to 6 tons of food, enough to feed a family of 6 for an entire year. The potato was nutritious, containing vitamin C, protein, and carbohydrates. When supplemented with buttermilk, it provided an almost complete diet. This miracle crop allowed the Irish population to explode from 3 million in 1750 to over 8 million by 1841, making Ireland one of the most densely populated countries in Europe. But this population boom masked a dangerous vulnerability. The Irish peasantry had been systematically dispossessed of land through centuries of conquest and penal laws. By 1845, most Catholic farmers were tenants, renting tiny plots from Anglo-Irish landlords. The average farm size had shrunk to just 5 acres, barely enough to survive on. These farmers couldn't afford to grow diverse crops or raise livestock. Every square foot of soil was needed for potatoes to feed their families. The rent had to be paid in cash, which meant any other crops grown, any pig raised, any butter churned, had to be sold to meet the landlord's demands. This created a bizarre and tragic economy where Ireland exported large quantities of food while its population survived on a single crop. Ships left Irish ports laden with wheat, oats, barley, butter, eggs, and meat, bound for England, while the Irish themselves ate potatoes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The first crack in this precarious system appeared in 1816, the year without a summer, when volcanic ash from Mount Tambora caused crop failures across Europe. The potatoes failed that year and thousands died in Ireland. Again in 1822, 1831, and 1835, partial potato failures brought localized famines. Each time, the British government and Irish landlords expressed concern but took minimal action. These earlier failures should have served as dire warnings, but they were dismissed as temporary setbacks. The Commission of Inquiry into Irish Poverty in 1835 had warned that the Irish peasant knows not in what other way he can possibly exist without the potato. Government officials toured Ireland and reported back on the dangerous dependency, the overcrowding, the subdivision of land into ever smaller plots. Yet nothing substantial was done. The attitude in London was that the Irish were naturally poor and backward, that their poverty was a result of their own failings rather than centuries of systematic oppression. The summer of 1845 began promisingly. The weather was good, and the potato crop looked healthy. Irish farmers planted their usual varieties. The lumper potato, hardy and high-yielding though watery and tasteless, was the favorite of the poor. In August the plants stood tall and green in the fields. Then in September disaster struck with frightening speed. The blight had arrived on ships from North America, where it had already devastated crops. The disease, a water mold that thrived in wet conditions, spread through the air as spores. Within days of infection, healthy plants turned black and putrid. Farmers watched in horror as field after field succumbed. The speed was shocking. A field that looked healthy at sunrise could be a blackened, stinking mass by sunset. The smell was unforgettable, a sickly sweet stench of decay that hung over the countryside. Farmers desperately tried to salvage what they could, but potatoes that looked sound when harvested turned to black mush within days. The response from authorities revealed the fatal combination of ignorance, ideology, and indifference that would characterize the entire famine period. British scientists sent to investigate offered absurd theories. The failure was due to static electricity in the atmosphere, or vapors from underground volcanoes, or the wrath of God for Catholic superstition. The Lord Lieutenant of Ireland declared that reports of failure were exaggerated. The Times of London editorialized that the Irish were prone to dramatic complaint and that the situation was likely overblown. Prime Minister Robert Peel, to his credit, was more concerned than most. He secretly ordered the purchase of £100,000 worth of Indian corn from America, fearing that public knowledge would drive up prices. But this response was both inadequate and misguided. The amount of corn ordered could feed only a fraction of those affected, and the Irish had no experience preparing it. They called it Peel's brimstone because of its harsh taste and the digestive problems it caused when improperly cooked. As winter descended in 1845, the first wave of hunger began. Initially, it was the poorest who suffered, landless laborers who relied on daily wages to buy potatoes. With the crop failed, prices soared. Potatoes that had sold for 2 pence per stone now cost 8 pence, far beyond the reach of the poor. Families began to sell everything they owned, furniture, clothes, tools, to buy food. The traditional support systems of rural Ireland began to strain. In normal times, neighbors helped each other through difficult periods, but now everyone was struggling. The first deaths from starvation were reported in remote areas of Cork and Mayo. Coroners' inquests returned verdicts of death from want of food, but these isolated cases attracted little attention from authorities. The British government, committed to the principle that private charity and market forces should address social problems, established local relief committees but provided minimal funding. The Corn Laws, which protected British grain producers by taxing imports, remained in effect, keeping food prices artificially high. By spring 1846, a deceptive calm had settled over Ireland. The survivors of the first failure planted their seed potatoes with desperate hope. British officials, eager to declare the crisis over, reduced even the minimal relief efforts. Charles Trevelyan, the British civil servant in charge of famine relief, declared that the Irish problem was solving itself through emigration and that too much aid would only encourage dependency. This fatal miscalculation would soon be exposed. Unknown to anyone, the blight had not disappeared, it had merely gone dormant in the infected seed potatoes that farmers were planting. The stage was set for a catastrophe that would dwarf the suffering of 1845. As summer arrived and the potato plants again emerged from the soil, Irish families watched with a mixture of hope and dread. They could not know that they were about to experience suffering on a scale that would shock the conscience of the world and leave scars that would last for generations. The worst was yet to come, and the true test of human endurance and British policy was about to begin. The horrors that would unfold would transform Ireland forever, but first, the full machinery of suffering had to reveal itself in all its terrible efficiency. The instruments of torture during the Great Famine were not iron maidens or racks, but policies and systems designed with a cruelty that rivaled any medieval dungeon. The workhouse system, imported from England under the Poor Law of 1838, became chambers of slow death across Ireland. These massive stone buildings, erected in 130 locations across the country, were deliberately designed to be so horrific that only the absolutely desperate would enter. The philosophy was simple and brutal: aid should be worse than the worst conditions outside, to discourage dependency. Families entering the workhouse were immediately separated, husbands from wives, mothers from children, siblings torn apart. They would never eat together, sleep near each other, or sometimes even see each other again. The walls echoed with the cries of children calling for their mothers, of husbands desperately trying to catch a glimpse of their wives through barred windows. Inside the workhouses, conditions defied human dignity. Inmates were stripped of their own clothes and given rough uniforms that marked them as paupers. Food rations were calculated to provide just enough calories to prevent immediate death, a pound of oatmeal daily, sometimes supplemented with buttermilk. But as the famine deepened and workhouses overflowed, even these meager rations were reduced. The buildings, designed for perhaps 600 people, soon held twice or 3 times that number. Disease spread like wildfire in the overcrowded, poorly ventilated spaces. Typhus, relapsing fever, dysentery, and cholera turned workhouses into death traps. The death rate in some workhouses reached 2,400 per week. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried, often stored in sheds or cellars until mass graves could be dug. The work requirement added another layer of torment. Starving men were forced to break stones for 10 hours a day, their skeletal hands bleeding as they wielded hammers their weakened bodies could barely lift. Women, many nursing dying infants, picked oakum, unraveling old ropes until their fingers were raw and bleeding. Children as young as 7 were set to similar tasks. The philosophy was that the poor must not receive something for nothing, even as they died from hunger. Those too weak to work received no food, creating a deadly spiral where malnutrition prevented work, which prevented eating, which hastened death. Workhouse masters, often former military men, enforced discipline with brutal efficiency. Any infraction, speaking during meals, refusing to work, attempting to see family members, was punished by reduced rations or solitary confinement. But perhaps the cruelest torture was the Gregory Clause, introduced in 1847. This law stated that anyone holding more than a quarter acre of land was ineligible for relief. For small farmers clinging to their tiny plots, this presented an agonizing choice: give up the land that represented their only hope of future survival, or watch their families starve. Hundreds of thousands chose to surrender their holdings, signing away their ancestral rights for a bowl of stirabout, watery porridge. Landlords eager to clear their estates for more profitable cattle grazing encouraged this process, sometimes promising aid that never materialized once the papers were signed. The psychological torture of this choice security versus immediate survival broke the spirit of countless Irish families who had farmed the same plots for generations. The eviction process itself became a form of public torture. The crowbar brigades would arrive at dawn, bailiffs, soldiers, and work crews armed with the tools of destruction. Families were given minutes to remove their possessions before the roof was torn off and walls demolished. To prevent reoccupation, landlords ordered that cabins be completely destroyed, often burning whatever the family couldn't carry. The sick were dragged from their beds and left by the roadside. Women gave birth in ditches as their homes were destroyed around them. In one documented case in Kilrush, County Clare, a woman was evicted while in labor. She delivered her baby in a ditch during a December rainstorm, and both died before morning. The evicting parties would sometimes find corpses inside the cabins, family members who had died days earlier but couldn't be buried because the surviving relatives were too weak. These bodies were thrown out with the debris. The soup kitchens, established in 1847 as an emergency measure, became sites of degradation and control. The Temporary Relief Act allowed for the distribution of free soup, but the implementation turned sustenance into humiliation. Recipients had to queue for hours regardless of weather, standing in lines that stretched for miles. The soup itself was often little more than water with some meal stirred in, nutritionally inadequate and sometimes contaminated. Some charitable organizations, particularly certain Protestant groups, engaged in souperism, requiring Catholics to attend Protestant services or renounce their faith in exchange for food. Starving parents faced the choice of watching their children die or betraying their deeply held religious beliefs. Those who converted were forever branded as soupers or jumpers, outcasts in their own communities even if they survived. The public works schemes, meant to provide employment and thus food purchasing power, became death marches for the starving. Men who could barely stand were required to build roads to nowhere, walls that served no purpose, piers in places where no boats docked. These famine roads and famine walls still scar the Irish landscape, monuments to feudal suffering. Workers were paid piece rates, meaning the weakest earned the least. In freezing rain and snow, dressed in rags, men labored until they dropped dead at their posts. Payment was often delayed for weeks, and when it came, it was insufficient to buy food at famine prices. Workers walked miles to the work sites, expending calories they couldn't spare. Many died on the journey home, their wages clutched in their hands, never to reach the families that desperately awaited them. Overseers, under pressure to show progress, drove the workers mercilessly. One survivor recalled seeing men working with the death rattle in their throats. The psychological torture methods were equally refined. The British administration's insistence that the Irish were responsible for their own condition added shame to starvation. Official pronouncements blamed the famine on Irish laziness, improvidence, and excessive breeding. The Times of London wrote that the famine was God's judgment on a backward people, that it would teach the Irish the virtues of hard work and self-reliance. Charles Trevelyan, the administrator in charge of relief, declared the famine a direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence, meant to reform Irish character. This narrative of deserved suffering penetrated deep into the psyche of the victims, adding self-blame to their agonies. Parents who couldn't feed their children were told it was their own moral failing. The traditional Irish culture of hospitality and mutual aid broke down under the weight of universal desperation, leaving individuals isolated in their suffering, tormented by their inability to help neighbors and kin who were dying before their eyes. The complete destruction of human dignity, the forcing of impossible choices, the systematic humiliation of an entire people, these were the true instruments of torture during the Great Famine. But to understand their full impact, we must look at the individual human beings who endured these torments, whose personal stories of suffering illuminate the cold statistics of death. Bridget O'Donnell was 22 years old in 1846, a mother of 3 young children living on a half-acre plot in County Mayo. Her husband Michael worked as an agricultural laborer, earning 8 pence a day when work was available. They had married young, full of hope, building their small cabin with their own hands, painting the walls with lime to keep them bright and clean. Their eldest, Patrick, was 6 and already helping in the potato fields. The twins, Mary and Catherine, had just turned 3 there. Red hair catching the sunlight as they played outside their cottage. Bridget was known in the village for her beautiful voice, often singing at wakes and weddings, keeping the old songs alive. When the potatoes failed the first time, they survived by selling their pig and eating the seed potatoes meant for the next planting. Michael found work on the public works, breaking stones for roads, coming home each night exhausted but proud to bring wages. They told the children it was temporary, that next year's crop would be fine, that God would provide. When the blight struck again in 1846, destroying even the few potatoes that had seemed healthy at harvest, Bridget watched her world collapse. The public works wages bought less and less food as prices soared. First, they sold their furniture, the dresser that had been her mother's, the stools Michael had carved, their marriage bed. They slept on straw, telling the children it was an adventure. Then went their extra clothes, her wedding shawl, Michael's Sunday coat. The pig was long gone, the chickens eaten. They dug up every root, boiled nettles and dandelions, made cakes from ground acorns that gave the children terrible stomach pains. By December, Michael was stumbling on the road to the works, his body consuming itself. He collapsed one frozen morning and never got up again. They found him by the roadside, his day's wages of 10 pence still clutched in his hand. Bridget couldn't afford to bury him properly. The neighbors, themselves starving, helped her carry his body to the mass grave outside town where dozens were buried daily without ceremony. Alone with 3 children and winter deepening, Bridget faced impossible choices. The workhouse meant separation from her children, but staying in their roofless cabin, the thatch had been eaten by desperate neighbors seeking anything edible, meant watching them die. Patrick, her bright boy who had known his letters, now lay listless, his belly swollen with hunger edema. The twins had stopped playing, stopped crying, stopped doing anything but staring with enormous eyes and skeletal faces. On New Year's Day 1847, Bridget wrapped her children in the last remaining blanket and set out for the workhouse 5 miles away. Patrick couldn't walk, she carried him while the twins stumbled alongside. Halfway there, Mary collapsed. Bridget left Patrick with Catherine and carried Mary a distance, then went back for the others, moving her dying children like this for hours in the freezing rain. By the time she reached the workhouse gates, Mary was dead in her arms. The workhouse admission process was designed to strip away the last vestiges of human dignity. Despite her desperate pleas, Bridget was separated from her children immediately. Patrick was sent to the boys' ward, Catherine to the girls' section, while Bridget was directed to the women's quarters. The last image she had of her son was his terrified face as a workhouse attendant dragged him away, too weak to cry out. She would never see him again. The workhouse register, discovered years later, showed he died 3 days after admission from fever and want. Catherine lasted 2 weeks. Bridget, forced to pick oakum while her children died in other parts of the same building, survived physically but was destroyed spiritually. She emerged from the workhouse 6 months later, one of the walking dead who haunted the roads of Ireland. Neighbors reported seeing her return to her ruined cabin, sitting where her children had played, singing the old lullabies to the empty air until exposure and grief finally claimed her. The story of the Fahey family of Galway illustrates how the famine destroyed even those who started with some resources. James Fahey rented 30 acres, a substantial holding that made him a strong farmer by Irish standards. He employed laborers, grew oats and potatoes, kept cattle and sheep. His wife Margaret managed a productive dairy, their butter known for its quality at market. Their 5 children attended the hedge school, learning to read and write. When the blight first struck, James felt confident they would weather the crisis. He had grain, livestock to sell, savings hidden in the thatch. But as the catastrophe deepened, he found himself supporting not just his immediate family but desperate relatives, neighbors, and the families of laborers who had worked his land. Irish tradition and Christian charity demanded he share while others starved. The grain went first, fed to cousins from harder-hit regions. Then the livestock, sold to buy meal for distribution among the desperate who appeared daily at their door. By late 1846, the Faheys were themselves in crisis. The landlord, an absentee living in London, demanded the rent in full despite the failure of the cash crops. James sold his last cow to pay it, leaving his family without milk. The public works paid too little too late. Fever struck the household, typhus, carried by lice that thrived in unwashed clothes and bodies. Margaret died first, raving in delirium about preparing butter for market. The eldest son, 17-year-old John, died next, his body covered in the characteristic rash of typhus. James, weakened by hunger and grief, couldn't care for the younger children. The hedge school teacher, himself starving, found the family in their cabin, 2 children dead, 2 dying, James sitting in the corner, no longer responsive to the living or the dead around him. The teacher, in a letter preserved in archives, wrote, "I have seen sights that would make the angels weep, but nothing compared to James Fahey, once the finest man in the parish, sitting among his dead children, his mind gone with grief and hunger. The most vulnerable victims were often those whose stories were never recorded, the landless laborers, the traveling people, the unnamed thousands who died in ditches and fields. But sometimes, through coroner's reports or church records, we glimpse their final agonies. In Skibbereen, the epicenter of suffering, a coroner's inquest described finding a woman and 3 children in a cabin so small that the coroner had to crawl to enter. The woman, already dead, was sitting upright in a corner, an infant still at her breast. 2 other children, ages perhaps 4 and 6, were huddled against her corpse for warmth. They were alive but so far gone in starvation that they couldn't speak or cry. Rescued and brought to the workhouse, they died within hours. The coroner noted that there was no food in the cabin, no furniture, no fuel for fire. The family had eaten everything possible: leather, grass, seaweed carried from the coast miles away. In the mother's pocket was found a handful of sand, which she had apparently been mixing with water to give her children the illusion of food. The psychological torture of parents watching their children starve created scenes of unimaginable horror. In County Cork, a priest recorded the confession of a father who had stolen food from his dying child, unable to control his own desperate hunger. The man died shortly after, whether from starvation or shame unknown. Mothers were found dead with grass stains around their mouths, having tried to pre-chew indigestible fodder to make it soft enough for infant consumption. One doctor, working in the overwhelmed Bantry workhouse, described children who had lost the ability to cry, their tear ducts no longer functioning. They lie there with eyes that seem too large for their skulls, making no sound, no complaint, just waiting for death with a patience that no child should possess. The complete breakdown of the parent-child bond, the foundation of human society, marked the ultimate destruction wrought by the famine. Parents abandoned children at workhouse gates or churches, hoping others might save them. Children watched their parents die and then lay down beside them, lacking the knowledge or will to seek help. Whole families were found dead in their cabins, positioned as if for sleep, having made the collective decision that death together was preferable to separation and continued suffering. These individual stories, multiplied by hundreds of thousands, created a landscape of suffering unique in modern European history. Each death represented not just an individual tragedy but the destruction of a family line, the end of traditions passed down through generations, the silencing of songs and stories that would never be told again. The survivors carried trauma that would mark them for life. Children who had eaten grass never forgot the taste. Adults who had survived by abandoning moral codes never escaped the guilt. The Irish language has a phrase, Bliain and Droghshawail, the year of the bad life, but this inadequately captures the complete annihilation of human dignity and hope that occurred. Yet even as individuals suffered and died in their thousands, the machinery of destruction was operating on an even larger scale, turning all of Ireland into a vast charnel house where the living envied the dead. The numbers alone stagger the imagination, but behind each statistic lay a human being who suffered and died in agony. By 1847, death had become so commonplace that corpses littered the roadsides like fallen leaves. British officials, touring the worst-hit areas, reported seeing bodies with grass-stained mouths, their final meal a desperate attempt to fill empty stomachs with anything that might ease the pain of starvation. In Skibbereen, one observer counted 40 bodies on a single street, many partially eaten by dogs and rats. The death toll mounted with terrifying speed from a few hundred per week in late 1846 to thousands per day by Black 47. Conservative estimates placed the death toll at 1 million, but many historians believe the true number approached 1.5 million in modern terms, equivalent to the entire population of Philadelphia or Munich vanishing in 7 years. This represented 1/8 of Ireland's pre-famine population, a demographic catastrophe unmatched in 19th-century Europe. The geography of death revealed the systematic nature of the catastrophe. The worst-hit counties Mayo, Galway, Cork, and Clare saw mortality rates exceeding 25% of their population. Entire townlands were depopulated, leaving ghost villages where wild dogs roamed through abandoned cabins. In the baronies of West Cork, death rates reached 70% in some parishes. Maps from the period, overlaying mortality with land quality and population density, show a cruel correlation. The poorest areas with the worst soil and highest population density suffered most. But this was no random natural disaster. The same regions that saw mass starvation continued to export food throughout the famine. In 1847, at the height of the dying, Ireland exported 4,000 ships' worth of food to Britain, enough to feed the entire population. Armed guards protected food convoys heading to ports while starving crowds watched. The juxtaposition was surreal and horrifying. Ships laden with Irish wheat, oats, cattle, and butter sailing past harbors where skeletal figures scavenged for seaweed. The infrastructure of death expanded to meet the apocalyptic demand. Traditional burial practices, central to Irish culture, collapsed entirely. The custom of waking the dead, where family and neighbors gathered to honor the deceased, became impossible when entire families died together and neighbors were too weak or frightened to enter houses of the dead. Mass graves, or famine pits, were dug outside every town and village. In some places, the dying were taken to these pits before death, laid at the edge to wait for the end. The fortunate dead received a coffin with a sliding bottom. The body would be dropped into the pit and the coffin reused immediately. Most were buried without any covering, thrown into pits that filled with rainwater, creating a horrific soup of decomposition. Quicklime was thrown over the bodies to speed decay and prevent disease, but demand outstripped supply. Dogs and pigs, themselves starving, learned to dig up fresh graves. In coastal areas, bodies were sometimes disposed of at sea, weighted with stones, but storms would wash them back onto beaches where children playing would discover horrors that marked them for life. The workhouse system, designed to accommodate 100,000 people across Ireland, was overwhelmed by over 300,000 desperate souls. By March 1847, workhouses designed for 600 inmates held 2,000 or more. Every space was utilized: chapels, worksheds, even outdoor yards were packed with the dying. Mortality rates inside workhouses reached 2,400 per week in some locations. The workhouse at Ballinrobe recorded deaths so numerous that they stopped individual registration, simply noting "many died today" in the logbooks. Children died at particularly horrific rates. In some workhouses, 90% of children under 2 perished within weeks of admission. The Cahersiveen workhouse in Kerry became so overwhelmed that the living and dead lay together for days, the staff unable to separate them quickly enough. Disease spread with lightning speed in these conditions. Typhus, relapsing fever, dysentery, and cholera turned workhouses into death factories. The fever sheds, hastily erected beside workhouses, became places of final abandonment where the infected were left to die with minimal care. The emigration statistics reveal another dimension of the catastrophe. Between 1845 and 1855, over 2 million Irish fled their homeland, a quarter of the entire population. But these numbers don't capture the horror of the journey itself. Ships carrying Irish emigrants were often unseaworthy vessels pulled from the timber trade, their holds hastily converted to carry human cargo. The infamous coffin ships earned their name from mortality rates that sometimes exceeded 30% during the Atlantic crossing. The Washington, sailing from Liverpool in 1847, lost 100 of 300 passengers to typhus during the voyage. Bodies were thrown overboard daily, leaving a trail of Irish dead across the Atlantic. Passengers were packed into holds with no ventilation, no sanitation, minimal food and water. The stench was overwhelming: vomit, excrement, and death, creating an atmosphere that hardened sailors couldn't endure for more than minutes. Children who survived these crossings often arrived at North American ports as orphans, their parents having died during the voyage. The demographic destruction went beyond simple mortality figures. The famine created a gender imbalance that would persist for generations. Young women emigrated in higher numbers than men, leaving behind a society of bachelors unable to marry. Entire age cohorts vanished. Children under 10 and adults over 60 died at the highest rates, creating a missing generation that warped Irish society for decades. The birth rate plummeted, not just from death but from amenorrhea caused by starvation, the female body shutting down reproductive functions to survive. Marriages declined precipitously as young people died or fled. The Irish language, spoken by the majority before the famine, was disproportionately devastated as native speakers were generally the poorest and most vulnerable. Entire dialectical regions were silenced forever. Cultural knowledge, traditional songs, stories, agricultural techniques, herbal medicine, died with the elderly who had no chance to pass it on. The economic scale of extraction during the famine years defies moral comprehension. While millions starved, landlords continued to demand rent, often evicting families who fell behind by even a month. Between 1846 and 1854, over 500,000 people were formally evicted, but this number doesn't include the countless voluntary surrenders where families abandoned their holdings before formal proceedings. Each eviction typically affected 5 to 6 people, meaning 2.5 to 3 million people, nearly 40% of the population, were driven from their homes during the famine years. The recently discovered Kilrush Union records show 16,000 evictions in a single poor law union between 1847 and 1850. Landlords, many facing bankruptcy due to poor law rates, cleared their estates for more profitable cattle grazing. The Marquis of Sligo evicted 2,000 tenants in 1847 alone. Major Dennis Mahone of Strokestown cleared 3,000 people from his estate, chartering ships to send them to Canada. His tenants pooled their resources to hire an assassin who shot him in November 1847, one of the few acts of violent resistance during the famine. The financial dimensions reveal the calculated nature of the catastrophe. The British government spent approximately £8 million on famine relief over the entire period, less than they would spend on the Crimean War in a single year. Meanwhile, Ireland continued to pay taxes to the British Treasury throughout the famine. The poor rates, meant to fund relief, fell most heavily on Irish landowners and tenants, meaning the starving were effectively forced to pay for their own inadequate relief. International charitable donations exceeded government spending, over £2 million was raised worldwide, with significant contributions from the United States, Canada, and even the Ottoman Sultan and Native American Choctaw Nation. But much of this charity was siphoned off by administrative costs or misappropriated by local officials. The Society of Friends, Quakers, provided the most effective relief, establishing soup kitchens that fed 3 million daily at their peak, but even their heroic efforts were drops in an ocean of need. The systematic nature of this suffering, the continuation of food exports, rent collection, and evictions while millions starve transforms the Irish famine from a natural disaster into something far darker. As we examine those who orchestrated and profited from this system, we see how human choices and ideological blindness turned a crop failure into genocide. Charles Edward Trevelyan stands as the architect of policies that transformed crop failure into mass death. As Assistant Secretary to the Treasury and the man effectively in charge of famine relief, Trevelyan wielded more power over Irish lives than perhaps any other individual. A devout evangelical Protestant, he believed the famine was divine intervention to reshape Irish society. In letters that survive in the British National Archives, Trevelyan wrote with chilling clarity, "The judgment of God sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson, that calamity must not be too much mitigated." This wasn't mere religious fatalism, it was active policy. Trevelyan deliberately limited relief efforts, cancelled food shipments, and refused to restrict food exports from Ireland, all while maintaining that the operation of natural causes must be allowed to run its course. He worked punishing hours at his London desk, writing memoranda that condemned millions to death, going home each evening to his comfortable house and family dinners, seemingly untouched by the horror his policies created. Trevelyan's background shaped his deadly worldview. Born into colonial privilege in India, educated at Haileybury, the East India Company's training college, he viewed the Irish as he had Indians, inferior races requiring firm British governance. His 1848 book, The Irish Crisis, revealed his racial theories explicitly. The Celtic Irish were improvident, lazy, and rebellious, requiring the harsh medicine of famine to learn proper British values of hard work and self-reliance. He opposed every measure that might have saved lives. Government food purchases would disturb trade, public works paid too much, soup kitchens created dependency. When desperate Irish officials begged for more aid, Trevelyan responded with lectures on political economy. To Lord Clarendon's plea that people were dying in thousands, he replied that the famine was the direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence, which laid bare the deep and inveterate root of social evil. His subordinates learned to frame requests in ways that appealed to his prejudices. Aid was justified not to save lives but to prevent revolution or to prepare Ireland for economic modernization. The willing executioners of Trevelyan's policies operated at every level of society. Landlords like the Earl of Lucan cleared 2,000 tenants from his Castlebar estates, using the notorious Gregory Clause to force starving farmers to choose between land and food. His agents would arrive at dawn with crowbar brigades, often timing evictions for winter months when survival without shelter was impossible. Lord Palmerston, future Prime Minister, evicted 2,000 tenants and chartered ships to send them to Canada, dumping sick and dying Irish at Quebec with no provisions for their survival. Major Dennis Mahone boasted in letters about clearing his Roscommon estates of surplus population, viewing his tenants as agricultural inefficiencies rather than human beings. These men published editorials describing the Irish as a people born and bred from time immemorial in inveterate indolence, improvidence, disorder, and consequent destitution. This racial ideology wasn't fringe but mainstream, taught in universities, preached from pulpits, and used to justify policies that would have been unthinkable if applied to English citizens. The intellectual framework that enabled mass death came from the emerging discipline of political economy. Thomas Malthus had argued that population growth would inevitably outstrip food supply, making periodic famines natural and even beneficial for reducing surplus population. Nassau Sr., the Oxford economist advising government, infamously stated that the famine would not kill more than 1 million people, and that would scarcely be enough to do any good. This wasn't considered shocking but scientifically rational. The doctrine of laissez-faire economics, championed by Adam Smith and refined by his disciples, held that government intervention in markets was not just inefficient but morally wrong. The invisible hand of the market would distribute resources optimally. Interfering with food exports or controlling prices would violate natural law. These weren't merely academic theories but the basis for policy decisions that determined who lived and died. Politicians and administrators could watch millions starve while feeling intellectually and morally justified in their inaction. The religious dimension added another layer of justification for mass suffering. Providentialism, the belief that all events reflected God's will, was particularly strong among evangelical Protestants who dominated British politics. Many saw the potato blight as divine punishment for Irish Catholicism, laziness, or rebellion. The Presbyterian minister Reverend Hugh McNeill preached that the famine was God's judgment on popish idolatry. Even more moderate religious voices often framed the catastrophe in providential terms that discouraged human intervention. If God had sent the blight, who were men to interfere with his plan? This theological framework allowed deeply religious people to witness unprecedented suffering while maintaining their self-image as moral Christians. The suffering of the Irish became spiritualized, transformed from a humanitarian crisis requiring action into a divine drama in which intervention would be presumptuous. The British Parliament, supposedly the guardian of citizen welfare, became an echo chamber of indifference and hostility. When Irish MPs pleaded for aid, they were met with derision and accusations of exaggeration. Lord Brougham declared that Irish distress was greatly exaggerated, and that the Irish people were always inclined to complain. Benjamin Disraeli complained about the cost of minimal relief efforts, arguing that English taxpayers shouldn't subsidize Irish improvidence. The few English politicians who advocated for serious relief, like Lord George Bentinck, were marginalized and mocked. Parliamentary debates reveal a shocking callousness, members discussing the technicalities of poor law rates while people died in thousands, arguing about the precise definition of destitution while children starved. The geographic and cultural distance between Westminster and rural Ireland allowed politicians to treat mass death as an abstract policy problem rather than a human catastrophe. The role of the press in normalizing horror cannot be understated. British newspapers, with few exceptions, portrayed the famine as a necessary corrective to Irish failings. The Times published editorials arguing that too much charity would only perpetuate Irish dependency. For our own parts, we regard the potato blight as a blessing. When the Celts once ceased to be podatophagi, they must become carnivorous. With the taste of meats will grow the appetite for them. With the appetite, the readiness to earn them. The Illustrated London News published engravings of famine scenes that aestheticized suffering, turning skeletal children and eviction scenes into consumable images for comfortable English readers. Irish deaths became a form of distant entertainment, their humanity erased by artistic presentation. Even sympathetic coverage often reinforced stereotypes of Irish helplessness and British benevolence, portraying the relationship as parent to wayward child rather than oppressor to oppressed. Economic structures ensured that those with power profited from catastrophe. The landed gentry, facing reduced rental income, used the famine to clear their estates for more profitable uses. The consolidation of small holdings into large grazing farms required removing the human population, and starvation accomplished what legislation couldn't. Cattle exports actually increased during the famine years as pasture replaced potato plots. Dublin grain merchants made fortunes exporting food while surrounded by starvation. The Bank of Ireland and private banks foreclosed on properties, accumulating land at rock-bottom prices. Insurance companies that had policies on emigrant ships profited whether passengers lived or died. The stock exchange saw Irish railway shares rise as companies used government relief funds to build lines that would serve the new, depopulated landscape. Every level of the economic system was structured to extract value from Ireland regardless of human cost. Local power structures amplified the catastrophe. The grand jury system, dominated by Protestant landowners, controlled local taxation and spending. These bodies consistently voted against poor rates that might have funded relief, protecting their own wealth while their tenants starved. Magistrates, drawn from the same class, enforced evictions and suppressed food riots with military efficiency. The Royal Irish Constabulary, despite being largely Catholic, followed orders to guard food shipments and assist in evictions, their loyalty to the system overriding solidarity with their starving countrymen. The complexity of collaboration reveals how colonial systems corrupt entire societies. Irish merchants, officials, and police became instruments of their own people's destruction, their individual choices constrained by structures that rewarded compliance and punished resistance. The medical and scientific establishment, which might have provided objective assessment of the crisis, largely failed in its duty to truth. The British Association for the Advancement of Science, meeting in 1847, devoted more time to discussing the taxonomy of Irish craniums than to addressing the famine. Medical journals published papers on the pathology of starvation without advocating for the obvious cure: food. The Royal Dublin Society continued its normal program of agricultural improvement lectures while farmers died in the fields. Scientific racism provided intellectual cover for policies of neglect, with anthropologists arguing that Celtic racial characteristics made the Irish unsuited for modern civilization. Even well-meaning scientists often approached Irish suffering as an interesting natural experiment rather than a preventable tragedy. The psychological mechanisms that allowed a society to tolerate mass death reveal the human capacity for moral blindness. Distancing, both physical and emotional, enabled British elites to discuss Irish deaths as statistics rather than people. Dehumanization through racial and religious prejudice made Irish lives matter less than English ones. The just world fallacy led many to believe that suffering must be deserved, that the Irish had brought catastrophe upon themselves through their own failings. Diffusion of responsibility meant everyone could point to someone else who should act. Landlords blamed government, government blamed landlords, local officials blamed London, London blamed Providence. The normalization of suffering through constant exposure created moral numbing. What would have been shocking in 1845 became routine by 1847. These psychological defenses allowed an entire society to participate in or acquiesce to policies that resulted in mass death while maintaining their self-image as civilized Christians. Understanding how this society-wide moral failure occurred is crucial for recognizing similar patterns in our own time, but first we must examine how this system of death finally began to crack under the weight of its own contradictions. The first cracks in the edifice of indifference appeared in the most unlikely places. William Smith O'Brien, a Protestant landlord and Member of Parliament, had spent years advocating for moderate reforms through constitutional means. But by 1848, witnessing the mounting deaths and the British government's callous response, he underwent a dramatic transformation. Standing in the House of Commons, his voice breaking with emotion, he declared, "I have seen sights that would move the heart of Caligula. Children dying in their mothers' arms, mothers dying with their infants still seeking the breast that has no nourishment to give. And this House debates the cost of relief as if discussing the price of cattle." His evolution from moderate reformer to revolutionary leader of the Young Irelander Rebellion marked a crucial shift. Even the privileged could no longer ignore the genocide unfolding before their eyes. The international pressure began mounting as news of the catastrophe spread beyond British control. Missionaries, travelers, and emigrants carried stories that British newspapers couldn't suppress. In France, newspapers published detailed accounts of mass starvation alongside reports of food leaving Irish ports. The Nation newspaper in Paris wrote, "While England preaches civilization to the world, she presides over the extermination of a people." American newspapers, particularly those with large Irish readerships, began campaigns that embarrassed British officials. The Boston Pilot published lists of food exports from Ireland during the worst months of starvation, creating undeniable evidence of deliberate policy rather than natural disaster. Frederick Douglass, visiting Ireland in 1845-46, wrote powerful testimonies connecting Irish suffering to slavery, noting that the slave is fed while the Irish peasant is starved. These international voices created pressure that purely domestic protest couldn't achieve. Within Ireland itself, the failure of the 1848 rebellion paradoxically strengthened the forces for change. Though O'Brien's uprising was easily crushed, the sight of landlords and government forces shooting down starving men who had taken up pikes and pitchforks shocked even supporters of order. The Widow McCormick incident became a rallying cry. When bailiffs came to evict her and her 3 children in Ballinlass, over 300 police and soldiers were required to overcome the passive resistance of neighbors who had gathered to protect her. The image of a military operation to throw a widow and orphans onto the roadside while food left the country crystallized the moral bankruptcy of the system. Parish priests, previously counseling patience and submission, began speaking out. Father John Kenyon wrote publicly, "I have buried more parishioners than I have living ones. I can no longer tell them this is God's will when I see it is man's greed." The economic contradictions of the system began creating fissures among the ruling class itself. Some landlords, watching their estates become depopulated wastelands, realized that destroying their tenantry was economic suicide. The Marquis of Sligo, who had initially supported clearances, reversed course when he saw entire villages on his estates emptied. He wrote to London, "We are creating a desert and calling it improvement. What profit is there in land with no people to work it? The cost of poor rates on empty lands, the loss of rental income, and the expense of maintaining order began exceeding any benefit from consolidation. Smart landlords started providing relief to keep their tenants alive, creating models that showed alternatives were possible. Lord Waterford employed thousands on genuinely useful public works, paying living wages and providing food. His estate saw dramatically lower mortality, proving that policy choices, not providence, determined who lived and died. The humanitarian response, initially scattered and small-scale, began coalescing into organized resistance to official policy. The Society of Friends, despite numbering only 3,000 in Ireland, established a relief network that exposed government failure through its very success. Their soup kitchens, operating on voluntary donations, fed more people more efficiently than the entire government apparatus. Jonathan Pym, a Quaker merchant, kept meticulous records showing that private charity could deliver food at a fraction of government costs. These records, published and distributed widely, undermined claims that relief was impossible or would bankrupt the Treasury. The British Relief Association, formed by private bankers and merchants, demonstrated that the City of London could mobilize resources for humanitarian purposes when conscience finally stirred. Their efforts, while insufficient, created infrastructure and precedents that government couldn't ignore. The Catholic Church, initially cautious about confronting British authority, gradually became more militant as the death toll mounted. Archbishop John McHale of Tuam, known as John of the West, began issuing pastoral letters that named the crisis as murder rather than misfortune. He wrote, "They call it famine, but when food leaves our shores while children starve, I call it what it is, a war of extermination waged against the poor." His words, read from pulpits across Ireland, gave moral authority to resistance. Priests began organizing communities to hide evicted families, to share food in secret, to maintain solidarity against the forces of destruction. The devotional revolution that followed the famine partly grew from this shared suffering and resistance, creating a unified Irish Catholic identity forged in opposition to British policy. Individual acts of courage multiplied and inspired wider resistance. Captain Arthur Kennedy, a poor law inspector, began falsifying reports to secure more relief for his district, risking his career and pension. When discovered and threatened with prosecution, he publicly revealed the true extent of suffering his superiors had ordered him to minimize. His testimony to a parliamentary committee, describing children worn to skeletons and families dying in clusters, made headlines even in hostile British newspapers. Dr. Daniel Donovan, the medical officer in Skibbereen, refused to stop treating the poor when his salary was cut, selling his own possessions to buy medicine. His published account, Diary of a Dispensary Doctor, with its clinical descriptions of starvation symptoms and death counts, provided irrefutable medical evidence of the catastrophe. The turning point accelerated when even the enforcing apparatus began breaking down. Police constables, ordered to assist evictions, increasingly refused or resigned rather than throw starving families from their homes. The Constabulary Report for 1848 noted numerous instances of failure to execute warrants due to moral objections. Soldiers, many Irish themselves, began deserting rather than guard food convoys past starving crowds. The 39th Regiment, stationed in Cork, saw mass desertions after being ordered to fire on a crowd attempting to stop a grain shipment. Courts-martial became so common that military authorities feared complete breakdown of discipline. Even among the Protestant yeomanry, traditionally the most loyal force, there were instances of refusing orders. Captain William Cox of the Tipperary Yeomanry was court-martialed for distributing military rations to starving civilians, declaring at his trial, "I would rather face dishonor than participate in murder." By 1849, the combination of international pressure, economic contradiction, humanitarian action, and institutional breakdown forced even the British government to acknowledge failure. The arrival of Lord Clarendon as Lord Lieutenant marked a shift. Privately, he wrote that Ireland was a kingdom of the dead and dying, and that previous policies had been a mistake of terrible magnitude. The Encumbered Estates Act of 1849, allowing bankrupt estates to be sold, acknowledged that the landlord system had failed. The increase in government relief, though still inadequate, admitted that market forces alone couldn't address catastrophe. Treasury officials like Charles Wood, who had supported Trevelyan's policies, began distancing themselves from the disaster. The Times, which had railed against Irish improvidence, quietly shifted to reporting on successful relief efforts and the need for reconstruction. But the true turning point was the mass exodus that turned Ireland's tragedy into the world's witness. Ships carrying Irish refugees arrived daily in Boston, New York, Montreal, and Liverpool, bringing with them stories that couldn't be silenced. The establishment of Irish communities abroad created permanent advocates for those still suffering at home. Letters sent back with remittances described the horror to international audiences. Thomas D'Arcy McGee, escaping to America, wrote, "I have seen Ireland crucified, and I will spend my life ensuring the world knows who drove the nails." The Irish diaspora became a political force that would influence international relations for generations. The famine was ending not because justice prevailed but because the system had exhausted its capacity for destruction. As we'll see, the aftermath would reveal the full extent of the horror while setting patterns that echo to this day. When the census takers went door to door in 1851, they found a nation hollowed out by death and departure. Entire townlands that had bustled with life just 6 years earlier were now populated only by tumbled stones and wild grass growing through the floors of roofless cabins. In County Mayo, enumerators reported villages where not a single soul remained, only the ridge patterns of old potato beds bearing witness to the families who had cultivated them. The raw statistics were staggering. Ireland's population had fallen from over 8 million to 6.5 million, but these numbers couldn't capture the true devastation. Behind every empty house was a family destroyed, behind every abandoned field a story of suffering that would never be fully told. The silence that descended over rural Ireland was not peace but the quiet of a graveyard. The immediate aftermath revealed horrors that had been hidden during the chaos of the famine years. Mass graves, hastily covered, were exposed by rain and animals. In Skibbereen, children playing discovered a famine pit where bodies had been buried in layers, the quicklime having failed to fully decompose the remains. The sight of small skeletons, some still clutching rags of clothing, traumatized communities trying to rebuild. Workhouses, finally emptying as death and emigration reduced demand, revealed scenes of accumulated horror. In the Kilrush workhouse, workers cleaning out the dead house found bodies that had been stacked and forgotten, some for months. The fever sheds were burned rather than cleaned, their contamination too severe for any other solution. Wells near workhouses and fever hospitals were found to be poisoned by seepage from mass graves, requiring entire water systems to be abandoned. The question of justice arose immediately but was met with systematic evasion. No British official was ever held accountable for policies that had resulted in mass death. Charles Trevelyan, the architect of disaster, was not only unpunished but honored. He received a knighthood in 1848 for his public service during the famine. When questioned about the death toll, he maintained to his dying day that he had acted correctly, that any more intervention would have demoralized the Irish people. Lord John Russell, the Prime Minister who had presided over the worst years, retired comfortably, writing memoirs that barely mentioned Ireland. The landlords who had evicted hundreds of thousands faced no consequences. Many profited from the consolidation of their estates. Major Dennis Mahone's assassination by his tenants was treated as terrorism rather than the desperate act of a starving people against their oppressor. His killer was hanged, while the thousands Mahone had condemned to death through eviction were unnamed and unmourned in official records. The survivors bore wounds that would never heal. Famine orphans, estimated at over 100,000, overwhelmed the inadequate institutions meant to care for them. These children, many having witnessed their parents' deaths, suffered from what modern psychology would recognize as severe trauma. Contemporary accounts describe children who couldn't speak, who hoarded food obsessively, who flew into panics at the sight of authority figures. The workhouse children were apprenticed out as young as possible, often to exploitation and abuse. Girls as young as 10 were sent into domestic service where they faced overwork and worse. Boys were shipped to colonies or enlisted in the military, cannon fodder for Britain's imperial wars. The physical effects of starvation, stunted growth, damaged organs, susceptibility to disease, marked an entire generation. Doctors noted that children who had survived severe malnutrition never reached normal height, that women who had endured starvation often couldn't bear healthy children. Among the adult survivors, the psychological scars ran deep. Famine fever became a term not just for typhus but for the mental breakdown that affected thousands who had endured the worst. People who had been forced to abandon family members, who had stolen food from their own children in desperate hunger, who had survived by acts they couldn't forgive themselves for, these walking wounded populated post-famine Ireland. Alcoholism soared as survivors sought to drown memories. The traditional Irish wake, once a celebration of life, became subdued affairs. Too many had died without proper burial for death to be marked with anything but sorrow. The custom of keening, ritual wailing, at funerals intensified, becoming an outlet for grief that had no other expression. Priests reported that confessions became occasions of heartbreaking revelation, as survivors unburdened themselves of acts committed during the worst times, parents who had eaten before feeding their children, neighbors who had refused to share their last meal, those who had informed on hidden food stores for reward. The social fabric of Ireland was transformed beyond recognition. The famine had destroyed the traditional rural culture based on communal cooperation and mutual aid. The rundale system, where communities worked land collectively, disappeared as those communities ceased to exist. The practice of coring, neighbors gathering to tell stories and sing songs during long winter evenings, died out in many areas, the houses empty and the storytellers dead or emigrated. The Irish language, spoken by the majority before the famine, went into steep decline. Native speakers had been disproportionately poor and vulnerable. Entire Irish-speaking districts were depopulated. Parents who survived often refused to speak Irish to their children, associating the language with poverty and death. English became the language of survival, of emigration, of escape from the horror that Gaelic culture had been unable to prevent. Attempts to document and understand what had happened faced immediate obstacles. The British government showed no interest in comprehensive investigation that might reveal culpability. When the Census Commission tried to calculate excess mortality, they were instructed to avoid speculation about causes. Local records had been destroyed, parish registers burned for fuel, workhouse documents lost in the chaos. Many of the dead had never been officially recorded at all. Oral testimony from survivors was dismissed as exaggeration or ignored entirely. The Roman Catholic Church began collecting accounts from priests who had ministered during the famine, but these records were kept private, too painful and too politically dangerous to publicize. Individual families maintained silence about their experiences, shame and trauma preventing the transmission of stories. Children and grandchildren of survivors often learned nothing about what their elders had endured. The economic transformation that followed revealed the true beneficiaries of catastrophe. Large farmers who had survived with capital intact bought up abandoned holdings at pittance prices. The Encumbered Estates Court, established to sell bankrupt properties, transferred over 5 million acres in its first decade of operation. English and Scottish investors acquired vast tracts of Irish land, completing a transfer of ownership that centuries of conquest hadn't achieved. The pastoral economy that replaced tillage required far fewer workers, cattle and sheep grazed where potato gardens had flourished. This new Ireland had no place for the millions who had died or fled. Towns that had served agricultural communities withered as their customer base vanished. The demographic shift was stark, from a young, rapidly growing population to an aging, declining one. The marriage rate plummeted and remained low for generations, as economic insecurity and psychological trauma made Irish men and women reluctant to form families. International response to the aftermath varied dramatically. In America, Irish immigrants nursed their grief and anger while building new lives. The fundraising that had sent relief during the famine transformed into political organizing for Irish independence. The Fenian movement, founded in 1858, drew its energy from famine survivors who had concluded that only complete separation from Britain could prevent another catastrophe. In Britain itself, a collective amnesia descended. The famine was reframed as an unfortunate natural disaster, with British relief efforts emphasized and policy failures minimized. School textbooks, when they mentioned the famine at all, portrayed it as a consequence of Irish dependence on the potato, avoiding questions of why that dependence existed or why relief had been so inadequate. The Times, which had published callous editorials during the famine, now adopted a tone of patronizing sympathy, suggesting that the Irish should be grateful for British efforts to help them through their difficulties. But the dead would not stay buried, literally or figuratively. Archaeological excavations continued to uncover famine graves, each discovery reopening wounds. In 2006, workers in Kilkenny found a mass grave containing nearly 1,000 bodies, many showing signs of scurvy and starvation. The positioning of the bodies, mothers clutching children, families grouped together, testified to final moments of human connection amid horror. DNA analysis of remains has revealed the youth of many victims, children under 10 comprising nearly half of some burial sites. Modern forensic techniques confirm contemporary accounts of the suffering. Bones showing evidence of severe malnutrition, teeth fallen out from scurvy, the characteristic thinning associated with prolonged starvation. These scientific findings provide irrefutable evidence of what historical records already showed: this was death by policy, not providence. The legacy of these events would cast a long shadow over Ireland and its diaspora, shaping politics, culture, and identity in ways that persist to this day. The Great Famine carved wounds into the Irish psyche that persist over 175 years later. Modern Ireland's population has never recovered to pre-famine levels, a unique demographic catastrophe among European nations. While other countries devastated by war or disaster typically regain their population within decades, Ireland remains the only nation with fewer people today than in 1840. This isn't merely a statistical curiosity but evidence of trauma so profound it altered the reproductive patterns of an entire people. The bachelor farmer became a stereotype rooted in grim reality: generations of Irish men who wouldn't marry until they inherited land, often in their 40s or 50s if at all. Women emigrated in unprecedented numbers rather than face poverty and repeated pregnancies without resources to feed children. The famine created a culture of delayed marriage, small families, and emigration that persisted well into the 20th century. The diaspora created by the famine fundamentally altered global demographics and politics. By some estimates, 70 million people worldwide claim Irish ancestry, more than 10 times Ireland's current population. These descendants carry inherited trauma that shapes their identity even generations removed from Irish soil. Psychological studies of famine survivor descendants reveal patterns of behavior traceable to ancestral starvation: obsessive food storage, inability to waste food, anxiety around scarcity even amid plenty. The famine mentality passes through families like a genetic inheritance. Grandchildren of emigrants describe being taught to clean their plates because people died for want of that food. This intergenerational trauma manifests in high rates of depression and anxiety among Irish descendants, what researchers term cultural PTSD, the inherited memory of catastrophe. Modern archaeological discoveries continue to reveal the famine's brutal reality, challenging sanitized historical narratives. Ground-penetrating radar has located hundreds of unmarked mass graves across Ireland. Each excavation tells stories that written records omitted or obscured. In 2019, construction workers in Cork discovered a famine-era mass grave containing 796 bodies. Forensic analysis revealed details that pierced the heart: children's bones showing evidence of scurvy so severe their teeth had fallen out before death, infants buried still clutched in their mother's arms, families interred together in final embraces. These discoveries force contemporary Ireland to confront physical evidence of suffering that official histories minimized. The bones don't lie, they show death by starvation, not mere disease, confirming survivor accounts dismissed as exaggeration. The political legacy reverberates through current events. The famine fundamentally shaped Irish nationalism, creating an anti-British sentiment that fueled revolution and continues to influence politics. Brexit negotiations revealed how deeply the famine still affects Anglo-Irish relations. When British politicians suggested using food supply as leverage against Ireland in trade talks, Irish newspapers erupted with references to the famine. The Taoiseach's response, "Ireland will never again be threatened with food as a weapon," resonated with historical memory. The Good Friday Agreement's success partly stems from both sides recognizing that historical grievances, particularly the famine, required acknowledgement if peace was to endure. Northern Ireland's sectarian divisions often trace back to famine-era patterns. Areas that suffered most severely remain Catholic and nationalist, while regions that escaped the worst remain Protestant and Unionist. Contemporary parallels to famine-era policies appear with disturbing regularity. When developed nations debate refugee quotas while millions flee starvation, when economic ideology trumps humanitarian response, when victims of disaster are blamed for their suffering, we see echoes of 1840s British policy. The European Union's response to African migrants crossing the Mediterranean mirrors British responses to famine ships, acknowledging the crisis while implementing policies that ensure most victims never reach safety. Modern equivalents of Trevelyan appear whenever officials prioritize abstract economic principles over human lives. The 2008 financial crisis saw Ireland forced to accept crippling austerity to bail out European banks, with EU officials lecturing about moral hazard while unemployment soared, rhetoric eerily similar to British lectures about Irish dependence. Scientific research has revealed biological impacts extending far beyond the famine years. Epigenetic studies show that severe starvation can alter gene expression in ways that pass to subsequent generations. Dutch researchers studying their own World War II famine found that grandchildren of starved pregnant women show metabolic differences, making them prone to obesity and diabetes. Irish researchers applying similar methods have found evidence of epigenetic changes in famine-descendant populations. The famine literally rewrote Irish DNA, creating hereditable trauma that affects physical and mental health generations later. This science validates what Irish families knew intuitively, that the famine changed something fundamental in survivors that passed to their children and grandchildren. Cultural production continues to grapple with famine memory. Contemporary Irish literature returns obsessively to themes of hunger, land, and displacement. Poets like Evan Boland and Paul Muldoon excavate family histories where famine memories lie buried under silence. Visual artists create installations using soil from famine graves, empty bowls, scattered stones from destroyed cottages, attempting to make tangible what statistics obscure. The annual National Famine Commemoration, established only in 2008, reveals how recent official recognition has been. For over 150 years, the catastrophe that defined modern Ireland lacked formal remembrance. This delay speaks to the difficulty of confronting trauma so profound it threatened national identity itself. How does a nation built on survival remember those who didn't survive? The weaponization of food remains humanity's most consistent cruelty. From Stalin's Ukrainian famine to Ethiopia's engineered starvations, from Yemen's current humanitarian catastrophe to climate change threatening global food security, the patterns established during the Irish famine repeat with horrifying consistency. Powerful nations and groups withhold food from the powerless, using hunger as a tool of control while maintaining plausible deniability. The same arguments appear. The victims brought it upon themselves. Intervention would create dependency, market forces must be respected, sovereignty prevents action. Modern technology changes the mechanics but not the fundamental evil, whether grain ships leaving Cork Harbour in 1847 or aid convoys blocked at checkpoints in 2024, the result remains mass starvation as policy choice. The lessons for contemporary society are urgent and largely unlearned. The famine demonstrated how quickly abundance can become scarcity, how ideology can override humanity, how racial and religious prejudice can transform crop failure into mass death. Climate change threatens to create multiple simultaneous famines that will dwarf 19th-century disasters. Will wealthy nations respond differently than Britain did to Ireland? Current refugee policies suggest otherwise. The famine showed how economic systems prioritizing profit over people create conditions for catastrophe. Modern capitalism's treatment of food as commodity rather than human right echoes the export of food from starving Ireland. When corporations patent seeds, when speculation drives food prices beyond reach of the poor, when trade agreements prioritize agribusiness over subsistence farmers, we recreate conditions that enable famine. The Irish famine stands as history's warning about the human capacity for systematic cruelty masked as economic policy. It reveals how prejudice, greed, and ideological blindness can transform natural misfortune into genocidal catastrophe. The million who died and millions who fled represent not inevitable tragedy but preventable horror, the consequence of choices made by those with power over those without. Their suffering demands more than remembrance. It requires recognition that similar choices confront us today. When we debate immigration policy, international aid, climate adaptation, we face the same fundamental question that confronted British officials in the 1840s. Will we prioritize human life over economic ideology? The ghosts of the famine dead haunt more than Ireland. They inhabit every policy debate that weighs profit against survival, every border that separates abundance from starvation, every moment when those with plenty calculate how little they can share with those who have nothing. The famine's truest legacy isn't the empty fields of Connaught or the filled graveyards of Cork. It's the recognition that we remain capable of watching millions starve while debating the cost of bread. The horror lies not in historical distance but in contemporary relevance. We possess wealth and knowledge unimaginable to the 1840s, yet millions still die from hunger while food rots in warehouses. Technology changes but human choices remain constant: feed the hungry or protect the powerful, share resources or hoard them, recognize common humanity or deny it. The untold suffering of Irish families during the Great Famine tells a story not safely confined to the past but urgently relevant to our present. Each skeleton in each mass grave represents a person who laughed, loved, hoped, and died in agony while others chose to look away. Their testimony, written in bone and blood across the Irish landscape, asks a question that echoes through time. When catastrophe comes again, as it surely will, who will we choose to be, the ones who hoard or the ones who share, the officials who calculate acceptable deaths or the rebels who insist every life matters? The answer determines whether we've learned anything from the million ghosts who haunt the space between what was done and what could have been done, between policy and humanity, between past horror and future hope.